Okay, welcome back to part 2 of our lecture on the Renaissance, the art historical lecture for Unit 5. And so right now we're talking a little bit about the early Renaissance, and here's probably one of the great examples of the early Renaissance by Masaccio. And this painting, is often shown to kind of talk about the very beginning ideas of the Renaissance, this interest in perspective, um, and being able to not only to do this architectural perspective, but to somewhat believably put these figures into that architectural space. Although that you could make the case that this God the Father figure here that's holding Christ is kind of floating forward a little bit, um, but uh, but still, I think Masaccio did a pretty amazing job, and I love the way it looks in the whole setting and how it's integrated into the architecture of the space. So, um, once again, the early Renaissance, and here's one of the reasons why I'm bringing this point up about that's kind of specific interest in depicting space and understanding perspective, as well as an interest in figurative, especially in figure studies and in anatomy and anatomical studies, is because it's kind of distinctly different from when we get to Northern European Renaissance. And when we get to the European Renaissance, we're going to see what qualities they bring to the developing Renaissance and how then those two different streams combine later on. So here you can see like this kind of obsession with perspective, even more so where notice how he's kind of thinking about this ground plane. Uccello here is thinking about this ground plane that these soldiers are fighting on, and he's thinking of it as in a perspective grid. So the the lances and the broken weapons are all lining up in this kind of perfect 1 point perspective grid, which is kind of interesting. And we get to Piero della Francesco, who is one of my favorite painters, and I think hopefully you can see that similarity I find between him and Giotto. They're very different in many ways. The way Del Francesco's figurative work, is just a little bit subtler. The way he does gesture, but there's a solemn solidity to these figures, a statuesque quality to them, and to the way he uses the colors, especially when he's painting in frescoes, that that feels reminiscent of Giotto, or kind of like a um, an early Renaissance version, like 100 years later, but there's similar kind of goal in terms of aesthetics. I love this kind of imagined portrait of Saint Augustine. We'll look at that again, I think, when we're talking about religion and art. So let's go to the Northern European Renaissance. And well, no, we haven't talked about painting. When we talk about painting, one of the things we'll talk a little bit about is the slow evolution that becomes eventually the invention of oil painting. And that's probably the main difference between the early Renaissance in Europe versus the early Renaissance in Italy, or in Northern Europe compared to Italy. Um, and that is that because of the types of techniques that the artists were using, they were also like in both areas. Well, like in Italy, they were primarily painting in frescoes and they're painting in tempera paintings. Um, but in Northern Europe, they were primarily painting in tempera paintings, but they were lacquering these tempera paintings with oil-based varnishes, and these oil-based varnishes were also create. They started to play with adding color to those varnishes. And what this does is, first of all, just the varnish itself enriches the colors and makes the colors last a lot longer. But it immediately kind of creates a new taste, aesthetic taste, in the Northern European Renaissance that's different from the aesthetic taste from the Renaissance in Italy. And there's a much more interest in rich colors, in rich values, strong value contrasts, allowing figures in dark clothes to be really dark, and for that darkness to merge with the dark space behind is a much more common thing to see in Northern European painting than in Italian painting at this period. I mean, look at how dark that interior space gets in there. And then by the time we get to Jan van Eyck, we actually have this transition become the invention of oil painting. I want to be clear, we don't know for certain that Van Eyck or Van Eyck's brother, the Ghent Altarpiece is actually by both Van Eyck brothers. We don't know for certain whether they or he invented oil painting or whether it was kind of just invented in culturally, right? But they were definitely there at that in that location at that time, where the transition from making paintings where they are primarily tempera paintings with oil varnishes and thin layers of oil color on top transitions over to paintings that are fully oil paint. We'll talk about exactly what is oil paint, different from tempera, when we get to the lecture on painting. But the main thing I want to get at here is that with that transition into oil painting, we have further this really interest in deep, rich values and deep, rich colors, strong value contrasts, right? And making things, and it's not so much about bright colors because we had lots of bright colors in the Renaissance, but the bright colors in the Italian Renaissance, but the bright colors in the Italian Renaissance were primarily pale, whereas here we're having lots of rich colors, even when it's rich neutralish colors, right? Um, they're kind of they are kind of fully saturated neutrals. There's something beautiful about that. Um, and I think that comes out of maybe in some ways two things. One is that a lot of the art in the Northern European Renaissance, a lot of the artists worked in printmaking as well. And so they have, working in, especially like with engravings or in doing etchings, you're really pushing value contrast. And so kind of creates a certain mindset that as a goal of an artist, pushing value contrast is a necessary thing that you're always striving for. And then of course also having the techniques of oil painting really also influenced that aesthetic. And we see that slowly start to creep back in to Italy. We're right about at the point where we're going to start to talk about the High Renaissance. Generally, we time the early Renaissance as 1400 to about 1480. And from 1480 to 1500 is this kind of transition period. And then we're clearly by 1500 into the High Renaissance. And then from 1500 until about 1540, 1550, kind of depends where you want to say it ends and where the Mannerist period begins, is a kind of debatable. But 1480 is a cutoff period I like for the beginning, and I usually cut it off at about 1530, 1540. Okay, so getting back. So we're right here on the cusp. You can still see kind of the look that's a little bit closer to the look of the early Renaissance, but we're very close to what we would call the High Renaissance. And now, when we talk about the High Renaissance, I'm primarily going to talk about the big three that many of you probably know by name, which would be Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael. Many people know them by name because they were then named turtles. And we will also talk about sort of the fifth Beatle of the group, the fourth most important artist of the High Renaissance, Titian. But before we do that, I want to talk about um, a really interesting and wonderful painter who's a little bit of an also ran. Um, Andreas Del Sarto is not in the big three or the big four of the High Renaissance, but he's close. I could have picked another artist. I could have picked Correggio. I could have picked Bellini as being the other artist I wanted to really focus on. But I do talk about Bellini anyway because of talking about Venice leading up to Titian. Anyway, that was my 1 minute warning. So I probably will end it here. So next, we're going to talk about Del Sarto, and then we'll get on to as I said, the big three of the High Renaissance.